Imagine a world where European powers, well, for centuries, they were pretty much on par with other major civilizations globally. Then, almost overnight, it seems, they leapfrogged ahead, gain global dominance. We're talking military might, sure, but also commerce, science, even medicine. It was just this profound, world-altering shift.
It really was. Quite startling when you look at the long view of history.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into this really remarkable historical event that profoundly shaped our modern world, the Great Western Transmutation.
That's the term our source uses, yeah. Captures the scale of it.
And our guide for this journey is an incredibly insightful academic work. It offers a truly global perspective, which is great because it helps us understand this transformation, not just from, a European viewpoint, but from a worldwide lens.
Exactly. It avoids that sort of navel-gazing you sometimes get, puts it in a much bigger context.
So our mission today is to understand what exactly happened in Western Europe between, say, roughly 1600 and 1800 that led to this unprecedented acceleration. What were the core drivers?
And the big questions. Why there and not somewhere else? And what was its lasting impact on the rest of the world? Get ready for some serious aha moments, I think.
Hopefully. It's a fascinating period.
So that initial image of Europe's sudden leap, it is startling, isn't it? Let's go deeper. What exactly was this Great Western Transmutation that fundamentally altered the global landscape?
Right. Well, it wasn't just, a gradual evolution. Our source describes it as a general cultural transformation in Western Europe between about 1600 and 1800.
Okay.
But what's crucial here, I think, is that it was a relatively sudden, in historical terms at least, though vast and complex, event that was constitutive.
Constitutive? What does that mean, practically?
It means it didn't just change things on the surface. It actually rewrote the fundamental rules of how societies would function from then on. It altered the very DNA, you could say the elementary presuppositions, of any subsequent human, social, and cultural development. A truly foundational shift. Wow. Okay. And the immediate impact was profound. By 1800, what were the most obvious consequences? What could people actually see changing?
Well, the two most obvious early consequences were, first, the Industrial Revolution, completely transforming how we produce things. Mechanization, factories, all that.
Right, the classic image.
And second, the French Revolution, which established entirely new norms in social relations, ideas about rights, citizenship, and the role of the state.
Okay, industry and politics. But you said there was a third.
Yes, and here's where it gets truly fascinating, I think. Simultaneously, a third, almost equally unprecedented event occurred, and that was the establishment of European world hegemony.
Hegemony. It's easy to just think of military might when we hear that, guns and ships. But our source suggests something far broader, doesn't it?
It does, and that's a crucial distinction. It wasn't just about Europeans having better weapons, though. They certainly could defeat almost anyone they came across by then. What really mattered, perhaps even more in the long run, was how their merchants were able to outproduce, out-travel, and outsell anyone.
So economic dominance, too.
Absolutely. And their physicians were starting to heal better than others. Their scientists could, frankly, put all others to shame. It was across the board.
So this wasn't necessarily direct world rule everywhere, like not planting flags on every single territory?
No, not necessarily widespread occupation. Not yet, anyway. The key was that both occupied area, the colonies, and technically independent areas were rapidly drawn into a worldwide political and commercial system.
Okay.
And the crucial detail here is, well, the source puts it starkly, the rules of which were made by and for the advantage of Europeans and their overseas settlers.
Right. So even if you were independent, you had to play by their rules.
Exactly. Even those independent areas found they had to adjust their governments, their economies, and even their basic mental outlook to the challenge of modern science as studied in Europe. The sheer presence and power of Europeans was enough. So the takeaway is that by 1800, Europeans and their overseas descendants had reached a decisively higher level of social power than was to be found elsewhere.
And this wasn't about individuals being inherently superior.
No, the source is clear on that.
Okay.
It wasn't about individual genius or anything like that, but how, when educated and organized in society, the Europeans were able to think and to act far more effectively as members of a group. It was about social organization and collective capacity.
Right. It's easy for many of us, especially in the West, to just sort of take this dominance for granted, historically speaking. We sometimes wonder why other peoples are, as the source puts it, stirring now.
Well, what's truly fascinating here from a world historical perspective is that the real question isn't why others are catching up now, but how Europe managed to hold such a unique position for what was, historically speaking, a very short time, little more than 1 century.
Only about a century. That puts it in perspective.
It does. To give you an analogy, you could compare the transmutation to the advent of civilization itself, way back in Sumer thousands of years BC. That also led to a much higher level of social power.
Okay.
But the historical pace just changed dramatically. Changes that once took, thousands of years now consumed merely centuries. The transmutation then kicked it into hyperdrive. Changes that took hundreds of years now required at most decades. The world was literally speeding up.
Decades instead of centuries. That's a mind-bending acceleration. So these were massive shifts. Our source breaks down what happened in Europe, what it calls the Occident, into 3 main cultural fields: economic, intellectual, and social. Could you walk us through those?
Sure. So economically, you had this great increase in productivity driven by new techniques, new ways of organizing work, and importantly, a concentrated control of production based on capital accumulation and mass markets. This is really what set the stage for the industrial and agricultural revolutions.
Got it. Capital and markets driving new techniques.
Then intellectually, there was the new experimental science. Think Kepler, Galileo, this rigorous mathematical observational approach, but also, more broadly, a philosophical exploratory independence. The Enlightenment, basically, questioning everything.
Okay. Science and philosophy breaking new ground.
And finally, socially, you saw the breakdown of old landed privileges and supremacies. Old aristocracy losing its grip, replaced by a new bourgeois, bureaucratic, or mercantile power. And this, of course, ushered in huge political upheavals like the American and French revolutions.
Right.
And the timing is key here. These decisive changes were clearly underway by the end of the 16th century, so around 1600, and they were pretty much completed, at least in some key areas, like, say, astronomical physics across Europe or cotton cloth production in England by the end of the 18th century, around 1800.
So that 2-century window again.
Exactly. And it's important to note the Renaissance came before this as sort of a necessary groundwork, a prior condition, but it wasn't the core transition itself. That happened later.
Okay, so we've outlined these massive shifts. Economics, intellect, society, all transforming between 1600 and 1800. But here's the truly perplexing question, I think. Why did all these profound changes happen at the same time? Was it just coincidence, or was there something deeper connecting them all?
That's a critical point. And no, it wasn't just coincidence. Our source explains it wasn't always a direct, simple cause and effect between fields. For instance, science and industry actually had relatively superficial contacts for quite a long time initially.
Really? So science wasn't immediately driving industry?
Not directly, not in the early stages as much as we might think. Instead, the argument is that all the changes presupposed common social resources and even common psychological patterns of expectation. There was some kind of shared underlying shift in mindset and societal capability that sort of allowed all these different revolutions to ignite around the same time.
Interesting. Now, many people have viewed this period simply as a shift from, a traditional society governed by custom birth status looking backwards to a purely rational one, driven by calculation, competence, efficiency, valuing change as progress.
That's the common narrative, yeah. Tradition versus rationality. Sounds neat. But we need to be a bit careful here. Our source argues that the standard image of a purely traditional society is largely a fiction. Even very primitive societies adapt and innovate constantly.
Okay.
And rationalization itself, meaning impersonal, innovative calculation, has happened many times in history. It wasn't brand new. It happened even at the advent of cities thousands of years ago.
So calculation and innovation aren't exclusively modern or Western?
Not at all. And here's a really surprising fact, according to our source. Islamdom, the land under Islamic culture and rule in the mid-Islamic periods, was actually more cosmopolitan and, in some ways, more rational in its institutions than the West was at the time.
More rational? How so?
Well, it apparently embodied more provision for things like rational financial calculation and personal business initiative within its established institutions. So, paradoxically, many supposedly modern developments in Europe, like, say, downplaying aristocratic birth or favoring individual contracts over group obligations, actually brought the Occident closer to what was already well established in the Islamicate tradition.
Wow. Okay. That flips the usual script.
Yeah.
So if pure rationality wasn't the unique new thing, what was so special about this Western shift? What set it apart?
Right. That's the core question. What's truly fascinating here, the source argues, is that it wasn't just a general shift to reason, but a shift to a very special form of reason. A form the author calls technicalistic.
Technicalistic.
Yeah, meaning that specialized technical considerations tended to take precedence over all others. Efficiency, precision, measurable results in a specific narrow field. These started to outweigh tradition, aesthetics, personal relationships, you name it. And this happened to unprecedented lengths.
Taking precedence over everything else.
Pretty much. And around 1600, a critical point was reached. Before then, you had these kinds of investments, both material, like in tools, and mental, like in specialized knowledge. But they were often sporadic and precarious.
Right, like a lone inventor here, a clever merchant there.
Exactly. But around 1600, these efforts became sufficiently large-scale so that they could be institutionalized and built on further and finally be made socially irreversible. Once that happened, these new and rapidly developing technicalistic traditions could just proliferate and take over.
Institutionalized and irreversible. That sounds like the real turning point. So this new emphasis on technical specialization was truly at the core of the new innovation.
Absolutely. Again, technical specialization itself wasn't brand new in isolated cases. Think gunpowder weapons or intricate clockwork, maybe.
Sure.
But now it reached a critical breadth of scale, a critical mass that allowed it to embrace and eventually dominate all the key sectors of the whole society. It wasn't just one or two areas. It was becoming pervasive.
Can you give some examples of how this looked?
Sure. Economically, you saw systematic capital reinvestment in places like 17th century Northwest Europe, specifically based on expecting continuing technical innovation and of anticipated expansion in market patterns. People started investing because they expected constant improvement and market growth.
Okay. A forward-looking, innovation-driven economy.
Intellectually, you had organizations like the Royal Society in England popping up. Their explicit goal was gathering and disseminating that new knowledge which would replace the old. They fully expected continual new inventions from the now professionalized instrument makers. Science itself became deeply dependent on increasing specialization in many different fields. You couldn't be a polymath in the same way anymore.
Right, the age of the specialist begins.
Precisely. So it wasn't just individual advances happening in isolation. It was a nexus of technical specialism. Think of it like a web. The technical efficiency of any particular activity was increased by its use of the fruits of other specialties, and it in turn served to increase their efficiency.
So they started feeding off each other, a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. A massive society-wide feedback loop. But for this process to really take off and transform everything, a major part of all the activities of a society had to get involved.
Yeah.
Couldn't remain niche.
So that's what technicalization means in this context, this widespread, interdependent, specialized drive.
Yes. The source defines it as a condition of rationally calculative and hence innovative technical specialization, in which the several specialties are interdependent on a large enough scale to determine patterns of expectation in the key sectors of a society.
Okay, that's quite a definition. Let me try to break that down. Rationally calculative, so focused on results. Innovative, always changing. Technical specialization, narrow expertise, interdependent, relying on each other, and crucially, large-scale enough to shape what everyone expects to happen.
You got it. That's the essence. And it's crucial to see that industrialization with factories and machines is only one aspect of this broader technicalization.
Right. It's bigger than just industry.
Much bigger. It covers things like power mechanization in agriculture, yes, but also pre-power mechanized industries that were highly organized, like in 18th century France, which covers the sciences, obviously, and even social organization, how bureaucracies worked, how armies were structured. It's this underlying logic spreading everywhere. And one consequence was it freed the privileged classes from being primarily dependent on just exploiting land and peasants.
Okay, so this technicalistic spirit, this drive for impersonal efficiency through precision, really started redefining everything. What were the psychological and maybe the moral shifts that went along with this?
Well, central to it, as you said, was the expectation of impersonal efficiency through technical precision. Now, efficiency always mattered, of course, especially in, say, military contexts. But now, in Western Europe, technical efficiency became, well, almost the ultimate value in many spheres. All other considerations, aesthetic, traditional, interpersonal, were increasingly pushed aside, made to yield to this new priority. Activities got organized primarily in terms of specialized procedures calculated to yield maximum efficiency for the limited ends immediately in objective view.
Limited ends, just focusing on the immediate technical goal.
Exactly. And our source offers a really critical thought here. It says, While this is rational in a narrow technical sense, to subordinate all considerations of ethics or beauty or human commitments to maximizing technical efficiency, however successfully, is quite likely to prove an irrational nightmare.
That's a sobering point, the potential dark side of pure efficiency.
Indeed. Let's look at how it played out. In economic production, the spirit showed up as this increased dependence on clever inventions, on statistical analysis. The focus shifted away from things like craft family continuity or personal status towards productively reinvesting returns on capital, leveraging external economies, and constantly keeping ahead in technique.
And the source mentions the patent office replacing the family trade secret.
Right. That's a perfect example. Knowledge became public, standardized, aimed at driving further innovation across the board, not kept within a family or guild.
So the precision and efficiency we see in modern factories, the specialized research labs, their roots are really here in this new technicalistic mindset taking hold back then. What about science itself? How did it change internally?
Well, in the scientific work, starting really with astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Kepler, this relentless drive for infinitesimal precision of measurement using highly specialized technical instruments became the absolute keynote.
Yeah.
You needed better and better tools to get more precise data.
Right.
But this intense focus on measurement and specific phenomena, the source argues, led to a kind of disengagement from ultimate questions, a loss of a sense of a cosmic whole. Scientists focused on their narrow slice, and putting it all together became harder.
So specialization led to fragmentation of the bigger picture.
It seems so. The source says every major scientist basically had to work out their own cosmic understanding privately, and alert lay people were left feeling like all coherence gone, as the poet John Donne wrote around that time.
All coherence gone. That's evocative.
Yeah.
And beyond the labs and factories, how did this mindset influence social life, even government?
In social life and administration, you saw it in the new absolute monarchies, the so-called enlightened ones. They adopted technical precision in their record-keeping files, reports, statistics. Bureaucracy became much more systematic.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time of the French Revolution, the whole concept of government itself had shifted. It was now seen as a public service to be judged by its usefulness, by its efficiency. This made every earlier governmental tradition in Europe seem obsolete almost overnight.
So what did this all mean for ordinary people? Did this efficiency focus trickle down into their daily lives?
Oh, absolutely. This new efficiency wasn't just for the experts. It spread to the general population. People increasingly had to cultivate a technicalistic viewpoint and technicalistic expectations just to function in this new world. Think about interacting with increasingly complex market systems or bureaucracies.
Right, you need a certain mindset.
Exactly. And there's a potentially dehumanizing implication here that the source points out. This extreme specialization meant that an individual worker, or even a scholar, could no longer really follow in detail the whole of the process of which his own work forms a fragment. You only see your tiny piece of the puzzle.
Like the assembly line worker.
Precisely. The source uses the example of Goethe, around 1800, being called the last of the universal men. Why? Because even someone as brilliant as Goethe couldn't possibly grasp all the technical processes happening in his time, whereas someone like Ibn Khaldun centuries earlier, or Leonardo da Vinci, could conceivably have understood most of the key technical processes of their eras. The world just got too complex, too specialized.
That's a fascinating point about universality becoming impossible. But, our source also notes that this wasn't all cold and mechanistic. There were also simultaneously important moral changes of a creatively human kind. What were those? It seems contradictory.
It does seem contradictory, but they happened together. One key development was the emergence of a new kind of character type, which the source calls the projector.
The projector, like projecting an image.
No, more like someone who undertakes projects. The man who would undertake new and imaginative efforts with resourcefulness and dedication. Think entrepreneurs, inventors, social reformers. But crucially, this wasn't just the lone private adventurer anymore. These figures came to represent hopes for new patterns of life in a wider public. They embodied progress.
Ah, I see, the dynamic innovator type.
Exactly. The source suggests this type became widely recognizable in business, science, administration, even religion. You could argue it's the kind of ideal figure Kipling later immortalized in his poem, If, that resourceful, dedicated, keep your head kind of person. That became a celebrated archetype.
Okay, so a new ideal of active, resourceful individualism. What else?
Alongside that, maybe surprisingly, there was what the source calls a gentling of manners, the rise of new, explicitly humane moral standards, especially among the educated classes.
Gentling of manners while society is becoming more technical?
Yeah, it's another paradox. Manners of the better classes were being softened and civilized. This meant things like less brutal persecution of heretics, even torture was being dispensed with in many places. There was this growing idea tied to the Enlightenment that with education, human minds and spirits generally might be enlightened and perfected, a real optimism about human potential.
Interesting. So a belief in perfectibility.
Yes, and this idealism, the source argues, helped mitigate the arbitrariness of state officials and even soften the destructiveness of warfare, which became increasingly limited in aims and disciplining conduct after the chaos of the 30 Years' War ended in 1648. Wars became less about annihilation, more about specific political goals.
And religion. Did that change too?
Yes. Groundwork was laid during this period for a more individualistic, religious consciousness grounded in direct human spiritual experience, rather than relying solely on elite mysticism or rigid communal dogma. Thinkers from Pascal to Schleiermacher explored this more personal faith.
So we have this intense drive for technical precision and efficiency on one hand, but also these humane, creative, moral shifts, this gentling, this individualism on the other. How do these two sides fit together? It feels like a tension.
It's definitely a tension, and maybe one way they connect is through a kind of selection. The source argues that the transmutation, while fostering certain kinds of creativity, also led to a significant narrowing in the range of reality that Occidentals were prepared to invest greatly in exploring.
A narrowing? How so?
Well, for example, there was relatively little attention paid to developing sophisticated personal health regimens compared to the focus on finding technical external cures like new medicines or surgeries. And highly specialized mystical or contemplative techniques like yoga from India or certain Sufi practices in Islam, which required immense personal investment, were almost ignored by mainstream European society, or even severely curbed if they seemed too disruptive.
So the focus was on external technical solutions rather than internal experiential ones.
Largely, yes. Overall, the source concludes this selective and recognizably technicalistic spirit, focusing investment on areas amenable to technical control and measurable results, was what both Westerners and Muslims at the time were to call materialistic. Not necessarily in the sense of greed, but in the sense of focusing on the tangible, controllable, material world.
Materialistic. And that's a loaded term, but I see the logic here. Okay, so this technicalism, this whole package, sounds like it fundamentally reshapes society at every level. Our source identifies several key corollaries or direct consequences of this. What's the first one?
The first, and maybe most obvious, is institutionalized innovation. The expectation of continuous innovation became deeply embedded in society. It wasn't just hoped for, it was planned for.
How is it institutionalized?
Think of scientific journals constantly publishing new findings, patent offices designed to register and encourage inventions, market economies driven by new products, even the very institution of a legislature. An assembly whose main job is to change laws, not to preserve old ones, embodies this. Progress became the dominant theme, the assumed direction of history.
Right. Constant change became the norm. What's the second corollary? How did it impact ordinary people's role?
The second is the rise of the mass participant society. The new economy, especially as it industrialized, demanded a large and mobile supply of skilled labor. You couldn't just rely on peasants tied to the land. And it also needed a mass market consumers with enough income to buy the new products, people living above bare subsistence. This eventually required mass literacy so people could read instructions, participate in commerce, engage with new ideas, and inevitably, once you have a literate, economically active populace, the masses become a political force.
Makes sense. Even dictatorships needed the masses later on.
Exactly. Even modern totalitarian states, the source notes, required active loyalty and participation from the masses in a way older empires didn't. You couldn't just ignore them.
Okay. So, innovation and mass participation. What about the role of the state itself in this new technicalistic world? Did it shrink or grow?
Oh, it definitely grew. The third corollary is an extended state role. The state's reach became enormously extended, entering every home in unprecedented detail and with inescapable efficiency. Think census taking, taxation, regulation, education, policing.
Right. The modern bureaucratic state?
Precisely. It started dealing directly with the individual, bypassing or weakening traditional intermediary groups like guilds, local communities, even extended families, reducing them to relative impotence. This powerful, impersonal state was seen as necessary, perhaps, to coordinate and control the vast, complex network of technical specialties that society now depended on.
Okay, a much more powerful, direct state. And finally, the fourth corollary. This one relates to the individual within this system.
Yes, the fourth is about the kind of individual this system fostered, and it's complex, almost paradoxical. Technicalism fostered an individual at once privately isolated and yet highly cultivated and cooperative.
Isolated but cooperative. How does that work?
Well, on one hand, there was a high valuation of individual freedom from controls by other individuals. This could lead to anonymity and impersonalization, the feeling of being just a number, the individual distilled into a filing card number, as the source puts it.
The lonely crowd idea?
Sort of. But at the same time, it also encouraged private integrity and personal growth and cultivation. And crucially, it demanded teamwork, a willingness to cooperate within these specialized systems, high personal moral standards like honesty and reliability needed for complex contracts and organizations, and respect for the individual's special gifts or expertise.
So bourgeois morality, in a way.
Yes, exactly. Bourgeois morality asserted its norms. Honesty, industry, loyalty, modesty, trying to rise above pure competitiveness. And it pushed for an equality of rights, perhaps even more consistently than in Islamdom at the time. The specialist was respected for their individual achievement, their competence. Human being itself became the only sort of unquestioned ascriptive status, the status you're born with. And this respect for the individual, the source argues, contributed to that mitigating public cruelty we talked about, the gentling associated with the Enlightenment.
Okay, that's a really complex picture of the individual isolated yet cooperative, valued for achievement yet potentially just a number. We've covered what the transmutation was, its technicalistic core, and how it profoundly changed society, morality, the state, the individual. But the elephant in the room remains. Why did this happen only in the Occident? Why Europe and its offshoots?
Right. That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And our source advises caution here. We shouldn't automatically judge cultural excellence solely by power or technical prowess.
Good point.
And while science and technology are incredibly useful, they aren't the only indicators of truth or human freedom or a worthwhile life. That said, the source acknowledges it was undeniably a tremendous human achievement. A real triumph for Occidental Peters in its own terms.
And critically, as you mentioned earlier, our source emphasizes that these new ways didn't just spring wholly formed from Europe itself. They didn't result from conditions entirely limited to the Occident. It had global roots.
That's a crucial point the author stresses. Just like early agriculture and city life required the accumulated habits and inventions of many different peoples over millennia, this great modern cultural transmutation presupposed the contributions of all the several citied peoples of the Eastern Hemisphere.
So Europe built on a wider foundation.
Yeah.
Examples.
Well, many earlier basic inventions that were crucial groundwork came from China. Things like gunpowder, the magnetic compass, printing. Even the idea of a meritocratic civil service exam system originated in China.
Right, those are fundamental.
And also vital was the existence of the Afro-Eurasian Commercial Network, this vast world market spanning continents which was largely under Muslim auspices for centuries before the transmutation. It connected economies and facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas on an unprecedented scale.
So the interconnected old world.
Exactly. The source states pretty bluntly, without the cumulative history of the whole Afro-Eurasian Orchomane, that interconnected civilized world, of which the Occident had been an integral part, the Western transmutation would be almost unthinkable. Europe wasn't isolated. It was part of this much larger system and drew heavily from it.
Okay, so the world laid the groundwork, but still the spark happened in Western Europe. What were the specific local factors, the unique combination that made it ignite there when the time was ripe?
Well, the source admits it's hard to be completely definitive. It's not fully established why it was Europe, but it offers some plausible conjectures. One is the relative rigidity and extensiveness of their own soil. The large, well-watered northern European plain. It was previously kind of marginal, maybe too cold or forested for really intensive agriculture compared to Mediterranean or Middle Eastern lands. But as population grew and techniques improved, it offered much room for expansion for a growing economy. Lots of resources.
Okay, untapped potential at home.
Second, geography. Ready access to other citied societies. Unlike, say, China, which had mountains and deserts insulating it to some degree, Europe was relatively open to interaction and exchange with the Islamic world and beyond. No Himalayas blocking the way.
Good point. Easy access.
Third, and uniquely perhaps, the crossing of the Atlantic. This opened up vast new lands, resources, and opportunities for trade and colonization that just weren't available to other civilizations in the same way. A whole new hemisphere to draw on.
The Atlantic advantage.
And maybe fourth, though, the source seems less certain on this one, a relative freedom from universal massive destruction and especially from alien conquest for a fairly long period leading up to the transmutation. Unlike the Middle East or China, which suffered devastating Mongol invasions, Western Europe largely escaped that level of disruption. This might have provided a more stable platform for long-term development.
Interesting. So resources, access, the Atlantic, and maybe relative stability, a unique combination of factors.
Possibly. It seems the combination, rather than any single factor, was key. And this raises another really important point about the broader historical implications. Historically, the source argues, major agrarian civilizations tended to maintain a rough parity in social power over the very long term. Why? Because basic new developments, a new crop, a military technique, tended to diffuse gradually across the interconnected world, usually over 4 or 5 centuries.
Okay, so innovation spread slowly enough that no one region could maintain a decisive advantage for too long.
Exactly. There was time for others to adapt or adopt. But here's the pivotal point where it gets really interesting and kind of tragic. The transmutation, with its incredible acceleration, broke down the very historical presuppositions of that slow, gradual diffusion. It changed the fundamental rhythm of history.
How so?
Because, in the new phase of historical change, when decades sufficed to produce what centuries had produced before, a lag of 4 or 5 centuries was no longer safe.
Yeah.
Waiting centuries to catch up suddenly meant falling impossibly behind.
The window for adaptation just slammed shut.
Precisely. The consequence was stark. Very shortly, at the latest, by the end of the 17th century, all non-Western peoples were faced with the problem of coping as outsiders with the new order of civilized life as it was emerging in the Occident. They were suddenly playing a completely different game, and they didn't know the rules, which were changing incredibly fast.
And they couldn't just ignore it.
No, they couldn't just continue developing independently at their own slower, agrarian pace. But neither could they simply adopt Western development, wholesaling. It wasn't like downloading software. It was a deep cultural and social transformation.
So they were caught in an impossible situation.
Pretty much. The outcome, the source concludes, was that the millennial parity of social power broke down with results that were disastrous almost everywhere outside the West and its offshoots. The global balance was fundamentally and often painfully reset.
Wow. Okay. So today, we've really unpacked the Great Western Transmutation. We've seen it wasn't just gradual change, but a rapid foundational shift rooted in the specific idea of technicalization, this relentless, interdependent drive for specialized efficiency. We've explored its complex impacts, the economic booms, scientific leaps, social upheavals, but also the moral ambiguities, the gentling alongside the potential dehumanization, the individualism mixed with mass society.
The paradoxes are key.
And we've considered why it likely erupted in Western Europe, building on global foundations, but ignited by a unique local combination of factors, and how its sheer speed shattered the old historical equilibrium, reshaping the entire global order.
A complex story with deep roots and far-reaching consequences.
So, what does this deep dive mean for you, listening? Well, hopefully it gives us all a clearer lens to understand not just Western history, but the historical trajectory of the entire world and the often uneven, unequal playing field that emerged from this transformative period. It helps explain maybe some of the dynamics we still see today.
Absolutely. And perhaps here's a final provocative thought to leave you with. Our source suggests that, despite all the undeniable progress, the basic moral problems of society were not yet fully solved by the transmutation, and that this progress came at a cost which no one could yet be prepared to evaluate.
A cost we couldn't evaluate then.
Right, so the question is, what unforeseen costs of that relentless drive for technical efficiency, that selective focus, that accelerated pace? What costs might we still be grappling with today, centuries later, as the entire world continues, perhaps inevitably, down this highly technicalized path?
That's definitely something to chew on. The story of the Great Western Transmutation and its legacy is clearly far from over. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep deep diving into the history that shapes our present.